Hala Gorani.
Hala Gorani.
Hala Gorani.
How do you get the truth? Look, the fact is we're all grown adults. You basically start learning who to trust, who is a rigorous fact-checking journalist. But this notion somehow bothers me is this demonization of journalists that people almost from all parts of society are starting to engage in. And that's damaging.
Have you ever been in the presence of leaders that you've given you an icky feel, or you made you just feel uncomfortable, the intimidating presence around them?
It's not that I'm not impressed by people. I'm always impressed, but I try not to get intimidated, because once you get intimidated, then your interviewing is not so positively affected by that, because then you end up not really asking those questions.
I have been watching CNN and BBC and these channels for the last 25 or 30 years. The news was updated and there was this lady that I watched. She would be there, a terrorist attack, a war breaking out, major news, an earthquake, something like that would happen, and she would be right there in my television talking to me about what was going on and how I should interpret it. And today, she's on the show.
The problem with social media is how people can distort what you say by clipping tiny little sections of something you say. That's why I pick my words carefully too, because I don't want to be misquoted or misunderstood. And I'm always worried that that's going to happen.
Please welcome onto the show the incredible journalist, TV presenter, and war correspondent, Hala Gorani. Hi everyone, and welcome to this episode of the podcast in partnership with the Emirates Festival of Literature. Now, if you're not yet subscribing to this YouTube channel or to the channels that you follow this podcast on, then I can only ask you to do so in the nicest possible way. So please subscribe. You've no idea what a difference it makes to us. It costs you nothing. All you got to do is press a button and it would mean the world to us. Right, let's move on with today's episode. Please welcome onto the show the incredible journalist, TV presenter, and war correspondent, Hala Gorani.
This episode is proudly sponsored by Allsop & Allsop Private Office, Dubai's first ever homegrown private advisory for the ultra luxury property market. Now, they're catering exclusively to high net worth individuals, ultra high net worth individuals, and family offices. They offer exceptional comprehensive advisory services with the utmost confidentiality and discretion. Bringing an elevated real estate experience that extends beyond property sales, the division is powered by the highest level of advisors in the Dubai property market, a select and dedicated team that brings unparalleled and comprehensive expertise to meet the needs of their elite clients. For a redefined era of luxury living in Dubai, schedule a consultation today for bespoke information and expert guidance.
Hala Gorani is on the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for coming. I'm going to say all the things you don't want me to say, but I've been watching you on TV for years. You've been epic. And so I feel like you're part of the furniture in my home, and I feel like I already know you.
But the good thing is we're the same age. So you didn't say that one thing that makes me feel old, which is I grew up watching you. That one usually tells me, maybe I'm on the older side of things. But I'm always very flattered when I hear it, especially from younger people, because that means that maybe, there was some sort of, I don't really love the expression role model, but at least kind of the illustration of what maybe somebody can become who comes from this part of the world. And I like that. I like hearing that.
You were not just reporting, but you were teaching. Mm-hmm. And you were showing us all those years ago when we were kind of looking as expats in strange countries at either CNN or BBC World as our two channels that spoke English.
I had a captive audience.
Yeah, you bet.
Not anymore.
But anything then that went on, it was just like you were reporting it, and so I was getting my news from you, and the more controversial the subject or the war-torn area that you were in was for me where the interest was, and you were there at the front line, and you were giving us what we needed to know, and I'd sit there worrying about you had women's safety because you'd have your press jacket on and a hard hat, and That was kind of like a really cool job to have back then. Did people aspire and you often say to you, I wish I could do what you do?
You know, what's interesting is I am not a risk taker, and I'm not saying that, I'm saying that in all seriousness. I really plan trips very carefully. I don't go into, I'm very much someone who, we do security briefings before we go places. We make sure we know where the closest hospital is. We make sure to always wear a seatbelt because, as I always say to young journalists, the riskiest thing you're going to do today is to get in this car to go to your assignment or to go to some place where there's fighting or a revolution or people firing in the air and stuff like that. But so therefore, I feel very confident that if something happens, then it's just plain bad luck, and that bad luck can happen to me anywhere. I could get run over in London, or I could choke on a piece of food in a restaurant in Italy or whatever. So I'm very careful. I'm not reckless at all.
Now, Syrian heritage,
Mm-hmm.
born and grew up in the States.
No, I grew up in Paris most of my life.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Where were you born?
Seattle.
That's a very, very Arab part of the...
Very Arab part of the world, as you know. Lots of hummus and meze served daily.
With your stuff.
Exactly. No, but I spent very little time there. Then a few years in St. Louis, where my dad was working as an engineer. And when my parents divorced, my mom moved to Paris, where her sister lived and other members of our family on my mom's side lived. And my dad stayed in the U.S., so I lived with my mom. And I was raised most of my life in Paris and went to university there. And after that, I joined Bloomberg. So that was my first big full-time journalism job in London. So I grew up, really, my childhood was in France.
And when you think about your choice of career, was it, I really want to do this, or is there an accidental step to fall into it?
No, it was a burning desire. And I never questioned that I wanted to do it. And I write about in the book about when Ronald Reagan was shot. And at the time, there were no cell phones. There was certainly no cable news, or it was the very beginning of CNN, I think, 1980 or so. And I had watched probably, breaking news inserts in regularly scheduled programming on an American network. And when my dad came home, I told him the story of how Ronald Reagan had been shot. And then I was kind of giving him a mini newscast, and I was 10. And I thought, wow, this was the first time I felt like this is giving me a sense of purpose, and I'm really enjoying this idea that I have this information and that I'm presenting it to someone else. And then little by little, I started really loving taking photos and documenting things. And I'm just a compulsive note taker and fact checker. And I started writing for my university paper and then freelanced for newspapers in France. And I never had a moment's doubt that that's what I wanted to do. There was never anything else I wanted to do.
And then joining Bloomberg, that's business and finance.
I had to get my foot in the door in somehow. Yeah, and that was the way to do it.
And you say that business and finance isn't, for you, a sexy or interesting subject?
It's not that it's not sexy, because it did give me a lot of... Here's the thing about TV, and this is really where I didn't necessarily want to be a TV journalist. I just wanted to be a journalist. So when I got into TV journalism and I was doing financial news, which is a very dry, picture-poor story, I had to figure out a way to make it interesting. So ultimately, when I did end up doing general news and things that were more colorful and easier to illustrate with visuals, it felt much easier, I think, than if I had started out doing that. Because if you're trying to illustrate a story on consolidation and the utilities industry in Eastern Europe, which frankly was a piece I had to do, and you have nothing but file of AP footage of factories from the 1980s.
Yeah.
And you can still manage to kind of figure out a way to put graphics and swooshes and a stand-up piece to camera in the middle. Then by the time you get to doing the other stuff, it's good training. It's good journalism school. Not editorial, but just in terms of how do you produce something visually.
So how long were you at Bloomberg for?
2 years.
And then?
Then CNN, 98. Yeah.
And the step into CNN was the same kind of work initially?
Initially, I was a financial news journalist. Then when 9/11 happened, the need for general news and especially conflict reporting became greater. Anybody who spoke Arabic was very, appreciated, because with the invasion of Iraq, that was a story that needed to be covered, and preferably by people who knew the region. So I spent time there, but ultimately I was anchoring almost 3/4 of the time. So I wasn't always in the field like I am now.
And back in those days when that happened, were the owners of the networks and the directors way more worried about a woman being in the front line, and that's why you would anchor rather than be...
No, that's not why I anchored, because CNN had Christiane Amanpour, who was and still is, the main conflict reporter. So they never, in fact, quite the opposite at CNN. They had many female camera people and female producers in Iraq, and some of their most visible reporters in Iraq were women. The reason I was doing more anchoring was because that was kind of the job that I ended up doing more. I was filling in more as an anchor. I think I was good at it, and they saw me as a good person to have anchoring big stories like the Iraq War or big breaking news stories. There were lots of breaking news stories in the 15 years that I was
We'll talk about those in a minute. What I want to try and understand is where you found your sense of purpose. So you knew from what you said that journalism was your thing. You already got into this stuff, and so very driven to get there. Then you go into financial news, and it's like, ho hum, okay, this is not what I really want to be, but I've got to go through some stepping stones here and work my way up. When was it? What job was it, or what were you working on at CNN where you went, this is the thing?
So I'm gonna go backwards. Okay. In 2022, I left CNN. And the reason I left CNN was because that sense of purpose that I had always looked for, of really covering the big news stories of our time, I wasn't feeling that and achieving that in the studio as much anymore. And so I realized that in my career, I was doing a bit of both. I was both anchoring, and I'd reached a sort of what some would consider kind of a pinnacle in a journalistic career, which is you have your own show in prime time and your name in the title of the show. That's considered, okay, I've arrived. And when I arrived at that point, which should be the end point of a career, I realized that's not where I'm not happy here as much as I should be. And the reason why is because that sense of purpose, which is what makes us all tick, right? Either it could be charity work, it could be your kids, it could be art, poetry. For me, it's journalism. The journalism wasn't being done in the way that I would want to do it. So I decided that I'm going to stop doing this. And in a way, I gave up what you would see as possibly, and I don't see it that way, but some people would say, well, this is the higher status. Like, here you are in the studio with a team and your own show. Why would you then go to doing special projects or field work for another network? And I'm much more closer to my original purpose. So that is answering your question in a roundabout way, in the sense that it took me getting to where I thought I wanted to go to realize that's not the end point that I want for myself. The end point that I want is I want to be a journalist in the field, and I want to write books, and I want to write articles, and I'm writing for Vogue Arabia and GQ, and I'm doing profiles, and I'm doing all these things I wasn't doing before. And my brain is working in the way that I want it to work now.
So there's two things there. One is a great amount of self-awareness that you must have to be able to identify that. But also it leans into the people that win the gold medal or win the World Cup or whatever it may be. And when they go up and they get that pinnacle of their sport, we're the champions, and they walk off the stage, and it's like, oh.
Yeah, what now? Like, where am I going now? I think
that wasn't what I thought it would be, yeah.
No, you're very right. And I think for me, it was a combination of two things, which is maybe this isn't, yes, I've achieved this, but maybe this, what do I do now? And also I've achieved this and achieved this status or this level, I've leveled up, whatever, to use gamer terminology. And now it's crystallized for me what I want to do in a way. And so I took the time off and I took a sabbatical where I had no job. My only job was to write a book. And I'm sitting in my kitchen every day. I got a little fat, I'm not going to lie, because I basically gained 8 kilos writing this book. So, because I wasn't moving much and eating a lot, I've lost some of it back, thankfully.
You look fabulous. That was ever your ways.
No, not at all. No, I wasn't fishing. I'm just saying that was one of the unhappy byproducts of it. But then after that, and especially when there was a lot of news to cover in Gaza and in the West Bank, and I was contributing for NBC anyway, and then so I started going in the field for them. And when I did that, I realized, oh, okay, this is like my perfect job for me because I do big special projects and big investigative pieces.
It leans into where you're at. Okay. There's some important things we need to talk about. Okay. And we live here in the Middle East, and I'll give you some examples. I'm married to a lady from Uzbekistan. Okay, we've been married for, I think, 12 years. She's Armenian by heritage. And her family, some of them live in Philadelphia, some of them live in Uzbekistan, and they have a very, very different view of the Ukraine-Russia conflict than the West tries to portray. They share their view. You're from an Arab country by heritage. We've seen what's happened in Gaza. There are very strong views from the Arab community that are very different to the news that's portrayed in the West. And then there's you, which arguably is almost the closest that someone could be to the truth.
Well, I hope that, and I can tell you most of my colleagues are as rigorous in their fact-checking and their journalism as I hope I am, and I work very hard to be. Here's
everyone wants to know.
Here's my journalism. Let me tell you how I view journalism. For me, this is why diversity is important. And some people seem to think it's an issue. It's not an issue, and here's why. Journalism is a skill. You need a skill set to be a journalist. There's a lot of fact checking. There's a lot of research. There's a lot of sourcing. I don't go to air without at least 2 sources. And if I have a single source, that source better be really high up. So there's that. That rigor, that skill, everyone applies it who's a good journalist. The difference between me and someone else is my worldview is different from your worldview. So if you go to the West Bank and you decide to report on a story there, or let's say you go to Tel Aviv and you go to Hostages Square and you report on a story from there, you bring your worldview with you. You bring your childhood, your past, what made you cry, what made you laugh, all of that. So therefore, what I'm attracted to, what I find interesting, how I ask questions is going to be different from the way you do it. Once that's all said and done, however, your fact-checking and your skill set that you apply to this is going to be, hopefully, the same, with the same rigor. That's why you need diversity in this business, because if you don't, you will have the same worldview over and over and over again. So what people complain about in this part of the world is we're not seen, Western reporters don't cover us exactly. I tend to slightly disagree with that. First of all, because it's their worldview. A lot of people are bringing their kind of, not bias, but their lens, okay, to the situation. Now, in this part of the world, you have many news channels that are owned, operated, and staffed by Arabs. So don't complain about what doesn't exactly fit your worldview. Like, you have the whole spectrum now of available options. And I think we're getting much better at that, even though because of social media, there's a lot more complaining that goes on about some of the ways stories are.
Hold on a minute.
Yeah.
If I watch the same piece of news on Russia Today, Deutsche Welle, BBC, CNN, Al Jazeera, okay, let's say the news is about Gaza for the sake of choosing a subject.
A totally non-controversial topic.
Yeah. Well,
yeah.
It's like you're getting a different perspective on that from most of the channels.
Yeah, that's very true.
The British and the American channels are pretty similar. Al Jazeera is very different.
Yeah.
If you want to watch Russia Today about a Ukraine-Russia crisis, that's a very different take on it, yeah? So you're right, the worldview is different.
Very fluid.
Okay, but is it the worldview, or are we being fed a narrative that suits the owner of a network? Just like we feel what happened recently with Mark Zuckerberg saying, because he did come out.
I can tell you what I do now. I can tell you.
This is the thing. You're trusted.
But what I'm saying is that am I going to agree with people who say there's this big agenda of people plotting in the background to impose their narrative and that's what I don't agree with. What I don't agree with is that, and that's not because I'm defending one way of doing journalism or another. I can watch something on a certain network and think this is not something I would do. It's not great. That's where I think I disagree with a lot of people that kind of have this conspiracy theory mindset. When I say worldview, that colors what you cover, what side you sympathize with, not in the sense that you're going to stop checking what you're doing, but like you're talking about Russia Today. Anyway, that's a different outfit. But let's talk about, for example, French news networks versus American news networks, and how say they cover. Or British. Okay, here's a big difference. The British news networks versus the French news networks and how they cover Gaza. They've been quite different. In the sense that in the British networks, there's been a little bit more maybe time spent covering the Palestinian side of things than on the French networks. Is that because those journalists have grown up with a different, I think, idea of the Middle East? For example, that could be it.
So how does the consumer ever get to the truth when you have, as Mark Zuckerberg said recently, you deplatform Donald Trump, you bring him back on. We're no more are we going to fact check? We're now going to not all of this. I can't remember what it was.
Yeah.
And he comes back on, and whether you're consuming through Facebook or Instagram, which most people tend to be consuming a lot of stuff.
Yeah, most people now, especially the younger people, are getting their news from social media.
Yeah.
Which is good and bad. So the good thing is obviously you have a lot more content and you have user-generated content, meaning stories we wouldn't normally have access to. We get to see them. The bad thing is the misinformation, the disinformation, the fact that, you get that brain rot because you're constantly like scrolling and stuff like that. How do you get the truth? Look, the fact is we're all grown adults. You basically start learning who to trust, who is a rigorous fact-checking journalist, more or less who's a little bit looser with the facts. But this notion somehow that what bothers me is this demonization of journalists that people almost from all parts of society are starting to engage in. And that's damaging. It's damaging, I think, to the discourse because it means that we are being sort of almost... It's as if we come to a story with an agenda. And I don't know, I try to say until I'm blue in the face, that is not true. It's not that we are applying the same skills to a story that we always have.
I had something very frustrating, but very much on the same lines of how you feel come to me this morning. With one of my team said to me, Spence, can you do a piece on the lack of fact-checking that's being done by podcasts?
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, excuse me? What do you mean? Well, they need to do more fact-checking, blah, 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 blah. Can you do a piece on that? And I'm like, what do you mean podcasts?
Everybody. You're a podcast host.
Everybody. Yeah, exactly. So I went immediately on the defensive.
Yeah.
Okay. Then I went, so what do you mean? It's not podcasts. It's everybody that needs to make sure they're checking the facts, not just podcast hosts. That was the first thing. But then I lean into what you said earlier. Ricky Gervais said something that I think is one of the most profound things anyone has ever said. And it was about Brexit.
Okay.
And he was on stage and he said, you don't let the average person vote on Brexit. He said, because the average person's an idiot. And he said, on a bottle of bleach in every supermarket in the UK is a label. And on that label, it says, do not drink.
Mm-hmm.
Take the label off those bottles of bleach for 2 years. And whoever's left standing, maybe they can vote.
Well, I'm not going to agree with that, honestly.
What I'm trying to say is that if you're going to be asked to vote on an important subject, you should be in a position to make an intelligent decision.
Yeah, of course.
But then two parties go on a sales pitch.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? The says and the leaves. Okay, go on this sales pitch of it's going to be like this, it's going to be like this, it's going to be like this, it's going to be like this. You should vote this way because it's going to be like this. It wasn't either. Okay, Boris Johnson was saying one thing, and it was literally a vote that came down to whatever it was, 49% or something similar to that.
Yeah.
People were told lies to get them to vote in a certain way. So there's part of it is a lot of people wouldn't understand. And then the other part is, how can anyone make an informed decision about anything if they're going to be lied to?
I mean, look, as a journalist, I try to avoid, because I still am a journalist and I'm in a position where I have to avoid saying things like people were lied to and things like that, because I have to keep saying, here are the facts that I've collected, and here's what people have told me, and here's how this story is going to be then presented to you as the news consumer. And if your conclusion there is, well, the person who said this was obviously using fabricated facts or lies to sell a political policy position to somebody, then that's your conclusion. I still am a very old-fashioned journalist in that way. I just am. I think it's a safe place for me to be. It's a comfortable place. And sometimes people just want me to say that incendiary thing. They're like, well, why won't you say he lied? Because I'm not an activist. It's not my job. I'm still a really old school reporter in that way. Why don't you call it what it is? I'm telling you what it is. You can call it what you want after. You know what I mean? So that's where I come in to that debate, if that makes sense. I have to be careful. And the other thing I would say is, and this, I'll say it on this podcast here. The problem with social media is how people can distort what you say by clipping tiny little sections of of something you say. So that's why I pick my words carefully too, because I don't want to be misquoted or misunderstood. And I'm always worried that that's going to happen.
Okay, so on this podcast right now, for everyone to hear, I'm going to tell you something. Okay, no clip will be made that I won't personally WhatsApp to you first. Okay, and make sure you're comfortable. Okay.
No, it's not that. I trust that you will. It's just that I've seen too often cases where people will have a tiny little thing that they said clipped and then misrepresented. I mean, there have been instances of, this is how dangerous our new media environment has become. There have been fake audio tracks laid on real journalism pieces that have gone viral. And by the time you've corrected that,
too late.
It's too late.
Way too late.
It's been retweeted 1 million times and the correction gets 200 retweets. And then everybody will come up to you and say, is it true that she said that? Or is it true that they were given this instruction to do this?
But the other thing to remember is news moves so fast now that you can be reporting on something this minute that's really important. And in 3 days' time, it's like people can't even remember it.
Yeah, but they remember this fake thing that was sent around and what that. Yeah.
Forever.
Oh, yeah. Not forever, but yes, it does.
Doesn't it?
It does. But what it does is, even if it's not that particular incident that people will remember, it's the pylon. It's one layer after the other of attacks with these fake videos and fake audio tracks and things like that. So little by little, it'll just kind of just become this permanent thing embedded in people's perception of our job, our profession, that is damaging, I think. And I wish it didn't happen so often.
Why can't two sides agree to disagree? We've got Donald Trump, we've got all this stuff that happened with the Democrats and the Republicans in the States. And one party won, one party lost. A few years ago, another party won, another party lost. And it seems to be that you lose friends because you voted Republican or you voted Democrat. I don't get that. And the reason I don't get that is I've lived here for 20 years.
Yeah.
We don't have politics.
Yeah.
There isn't politics. So there's nothing.
But you wouldn't lose friends over, say, I don't know, you could discuss other issues that aren't related necessarily to regional or local politics. I mean, you could discuss, there's enough to disagree on if you're living in a country like Lebanon, or if you're, there are many issues there but I get people fired up.
I think first of all, we're in a very cosmopolitan place, but
Yeah.
I think that we're way more alike than we are different.
Yeah.
But I also believe that if you think differently, you know what, that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
I mean, I'm like that in my life. They're on a lot of.
But why in the US do we get all this reporting coming through that everyone hates each other because they blame each other almost?
I think because specifically in this time in history in the US, you have such a deep divide between the sides, for one thing. And secondly, I think social media is accentuating all of these divisions. And they're making these divisions more, I think they're giving, keyboard warriors and people who have nasty things to say a much bigger platform than before. I mean, we said we're the same age. When we grew up and there were political disagreements, you didn't have people going on social media and Twitter and things like that and trolling and insulting and threatening. And it's bringing out the worst in people, isn't it? I think.
Who did we have? Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan when we were younger, didn't we? They were kind of like quite prominent for us in terms of the leaders.
I mean, when I was a kid growing up, the big political figures were, there were the much more traditional, Republican conservatives. So there was Reagan, and then there was Carter before that when I was a kid.
Yeah, but we were kids when Carter was around and McNeil was around. We were kids.
I interviewed him though. So
did you?
For him, yeah. Great. It was fabulous.
Oh, let's talk about some of those highlights.
2012. Yeah, he was, because the Carter Center was an observer at the 2012 Egyptian elections after Mubarak stepped down, and they had their first, free and fair election, and Mohamed Morsi was elected that year. And he was there as an observer. And I always saw Carter because growing up in a Middle Eastern household, Carter was, of course, the Camp David president. And he was the only president, really, you could argue, who achieved a lasting peace agreement between Arab nations and Israel, both Egypt and Jordan, of course. So it was a big deal to meet him, especially in Egypt. And he's everything he was. I mean, he just passed away, but he was everything that you think about him, just, humanitarian and very humble and,
statesman-like.
He was less of an imposing kind of intimidating figure than other, not that there was no great respect of extended toward him, but it was more that his presence was, he just kind of was a very warm, smiling.
And that's nice. Have you ever been in the presence of leaders that you've given you an icky feel, or you made you just feel uncomfortable, the intimidating presence around them? Fear.
So fear, no. I have to say, if I am very lucky that I don't ever feel really intimidated. And I don't want this to come across. It's not that I'm not impressed by people. I'm always impressed, especially artists and things who I've admired a long time. When I meet them, I'm very impressed and happy and excited. But I try not to get intimidated, because once you get intimidated, then your interviewing is, I think, maybe not so positively affected by that, because then you end up not really asking the questions that. Yeah. So, but of course, there are some figures, let me think, who are more, I don't know, President Erdogan, for instance, is a lot taller than you think.
Is he?
He's like 6'5" or something. I mean, he's absolutely gigantic. So when you see him walk in, you're like, oh my goodness, yeah, you are very tall. No, yeah, I know. And then there are the leaders who are shorter than you think they are. But he's much taller than you think he is when you see him on TV. He's like 6'4", I think.
I'm hogging you all to myself. We're here at the Emirates Festival of Literature. We haven't spoken about your book.
Oh, yeah, please.
My apologies. Tell me about writing books, what it's like, how writing your first book was, and the experience. I had Lord Jeffrey Archer on the show last year, and he writes every single book by hand, sits at his desk overlooking the River Thames, and from Cain and Abel all the way through to the ones he does today. He said, no, you have to write them by hand, and you have to use a fountain pen, boy. And, and if you don't like cricket, then you're an idiot. And if you don't like Arsenal Football Club, then you're also an imbecile.
I'd say all the same things. So if you don't like cricket, you're an idiot, Spencer. That's what I always say.
When you think about it, writing your first book, you obviously have written many articles along the way, very many pieces. So writing wasn't a beginning of a journey for you, but...
Yeah, but obviously it's very different. So, by the way, I'm going to show you, here's my love of, where is it? My love of hand, and I know we're on a podcast, so people won't see that. But everything I do, all my stories, I write them by hand first.
In shorthand or in... No,
in long cursive. So, for example, I will write, I wrote an article for GQ on a Syrian activist. It's coming out next week.
So let's just open that big up there, because that will give us some context. Yeah, it's 2/3 of a page.
Yeah.
Bullet points that you write down.
So this is kind of just his bio a little bit, so I can remind myself of that. But importantly, I think it's more how I do the TV pieces. So the TV pieces, I will go, for example, you see here, this is when I write a TV piece. This is the time code. You have that in podcasts, the time code. So this is where in the video it is. So this is what I know I want to reference visually in my piece. And then I might go and write by hand some of the sound bites. So these are the sound bites that I will kind of
And you've written the script by hand?
No, then the script I go on my computer.
Oh, really?
So these are the notes. But then once I'm done with these notes, the writing itself is about 10 minutes because it's almost all done, basically.
Got it.
Now for the book, and I don't claim to be on any level the best-selling author that Jeffrey Archer is, but what I learned is that it is a job like going to the gym. So you have to wake up, and every day at the same time you sit at the desk, whether you're inspired, not inspired, tired, you have a cold, you have COVID, which I did twice during the time that I was writing it, and sit there and sit your butt down on the chair and write for 4 hours. That was my thing. So for 4 hours from 11 a.m., and then I would write all the way for 4 hours until I was done. And then I would eat lunch. But it had to be every day because otherwise I wouldn't do it. And
how many of those 4-hour sessions were there? How many months?
Not long at all, because the thing is I was writing so many hours a week.
Yeah.
So my first draft, it really is. My first draft took me 3 months. But then the rewriting was the painful part. Editing, rewriting, reorganizing the structure, which, by the way, the structure, is non-chronological. And I got a lot of people who commented about that. But it's meant to be read. Each chapter is a city and a place. And that is, it's almost like 11 mini novels. So 11 novellas. So each chapter is a chronology from beginning to end in one space. But ultimately, the book does form an arc. So that's how I did it. And I realized that the research took a lot longer. It was a little bit similar to this. So I did a lot of the research before. A lot of it was written by hand as well. But then when it came to writing the book, I wrote on a computer. It would have driven me nuts to have to write 80,000 words by hand. I don't know how some people do that, but good for them. So yeah, that was the discovery. So I wrote it between October. Basically, the writing was between September, October 2022 and about March 2020. Wait, what year are we? 2025. Oh my God, I'm losing my mind. Yeah, so I wrote it between September 22 and March 23, just about.
Okay, for the benefit of everyone that hasn't read it and understand it, tell us what the book's about.
The book is about a search for identity and belonging as an Arab American, born in America, raised in France with Syrian parents, and where and that search for home. And it's really overlaid on the history of Syria and the Middle East with some of my reporting peppered in, so that it tells the story of displacement, of a search for identity that goes all the way from the end of the 19th century to today, weaving in my own story and my journalism. So that's the kind of the elevator pitch for the book. And I realize now that it was a great thing to do to find myself. And it was a great thing to leave in the past too, in a sense.
Ooh.
Because I always say introspection is great, but too much of it becomes navel gazing. And I think you need to be out of your head. And when we discussed purpose, right, the purpose of journalism is by definition not thinking about yourself.
Yeah.
And I think when you think about yourself a little too much, it's actually not really good for your mental health. There's something, that's why, there are studies about how people who do charitable work become happier, because what they're doing really is they're going out of their own thoughts into a work of service to others. And that work of service to others is what, and it gives you the purpose, and purpose makes you happy. And that purpose can be charity, children, your podcast, but it's got to be a purpose greater than yourself, I think.
I made a documentary about human trafficking, and I told the story about 3 women that were heroes.
Uh-huh.
And those women have had such an incredible impact on my life. And I do what I can to support those women now.
Yeah.
And when I'm with the children that have been treated as badly as these kids have, I am the happiest I can be. It's almost like
Well, you're proving my point.
an injection in my arm on a Sunday evening when I go for supper with them that lasts a week. Of gratitude, of joy, because my worst day ever is beyond the wildest dreams of their best day ever.
Of course, yeah.
It's like,
And it's this, I think, and it's not just reporting on misery and things like that. It's also just thinking about someone else.
Yeah.
Even if it's for a positive story. And honestly, there is I think there is a good and healthy discussion about mental health, about how we have to look for our own, triggers and trauma and stuff like that. I personally, once I feel like, unless of course you've survived something terrible like what you're describing, but it's good to sometimes then just like say, okay, I've done the work.
mm,
It's cheaper than therapy. Took me less time because I'm a fast writer. And now I'm I've just kind of done that. And now I'm ready to write a novel, I've decided.
was it a good experience?
It was both good and painful. So the painful part was the editing part, because you have to, and I really liked my editor, but I think we had sometimes different ideas for, obviously she knows better than me because that's her job, but the editing part, the restructuring part was painful. The writing part itself was very pleasant. I love writing, so and also the other thing I discovered is that, how I told you have to write whether you're inspired or not?
Yeah.
Weirdly, on days I wasn't feeling it at all are some of the days when what came out was actually some of the best stuff.
Oh, yeah. So maybe you went into a darker place.
It wasn't that it was darker. It was just that I don't know. Your brain just works in weird ways, and just produced some of the better prose and some of the better ideas. And then some days when you think, I don't know if Spencer, this has ever happened to you, but when you have something in your head and then you put it on paper and it just sounds awful. Does that ever happen to you? Because it happened to me.
Yeah.
I'm like, this is going to sound so evocative. It's so poetic. And I'm going to write this down. And it's just this cliche crap. And it just sounds like some poetry a 14-year-old tried to write and sound really like, emotional and stuff. And so on some days that happened. And then on other days, you're like, everything I'm going to write is going to be garbage. And then this just brilliant turn of phrase comes up, and that happened. That's something I discovered.
What's the name of the book?
my book,
Yeah.
but you don't look Arab.
But you don't look at
And other tales, of unbelonging. So both the title and the subtitle kind of are signpost what the book is about. But I hope it's also about the Middle East, about journalism. There's a bit of my love life in there, which wasn't always fabulous. Now I can laugh about it. Believe me, I wasn't laughing about it when I was 30 or 35. But yeah, and I hope women too will read it and see in it something that they can relate to, and that there's always, I think a lot of women are still under quite a bit of pressure to achieve certain things by a certain age. And I was a late bloomer in everything. And it's been great.
I would spend hours and hours and hours talking with you. You're my kind of person.
Oh, well, thank you.
They say if you're exposed to somebody for 7 hours in different ways, in different formats, after 7 hours, you think that you know that person. And so I would argue there's 700 hours of you that I assumed over the years. So I think I really know you.
Good. Well, I'm glad. But as I said to you earlier, the thing about CNN for many years is you didn't really have much of a choice. There we were, if you wanted to know the news. Now there are many, and this does circle us back to and then just the last thing I'll say, this does circle us back to the idea now that the media landscape is so diverse, and we're all better off for it, I think. I really think ultimately it's better. We have a lot of voices.
Well, thank you for filling my airwaves over the years. I promise you, it's an absolute joy to know that I got a chance to sit and talk to someone I've been watching for so many years. It's a real pleasure.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Good to chat.
Thank you.